Jack, thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Do you want to hear me in the back? Okay, great. Okay, thank you. If you come up, I'm not going to take a second collection. I'm not a priest, so you're safe. Okay, I'm Delegate Bob Marshall. I've worked in Congress for 6 years for 3 pro-life members of Congress, 1 Democrat and two Republicans. I've been in the state legislature. I was first elected in 1991. My last election was in 2013, where I won by 498 votes against somebody who outspent me probably more than 4.5 to 1. Still had a victory, closer. I devised the partial birth abortion ban for Virginia, overrode Governor Warner on that, who's now a U.S. Senator. I'm the author of the Virginia Marriage Amendment, called the Marshall-Newman Amendment, which was overturned by a group of 5 lawyers who represent no one but themselves, constituted as the Supreme Court. I am very candid in my positions. This is a newsletter that I'm sending out to about 12 or 13,000 people, households. In here, I talk about safeguarding women's health, and I talk about the abortion clinic regulations that we passed. And down here, I talk about civil rights and sexual orientation. So, unlike most Republicans, I do not duck these issues, which may attest to my lack of common sense, but these have to be addressed in one way or the other. So I do deal with this. And Jack is correct. In 1976, a friend of mine gave me the results of a Freedom of Information Act that indicated that the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare had probably aborted, killed 300,000 children with tax money. In 1976, a lot of members of Congress didn't know that this was going on. I took this FOIA and I went to the cloakroom in the House of Representatives, pulled a congressman from Southern Maryland off the floor of the House, showed him the FOIA, and said we need to get an amendment cutting off funding. Now, even if we lost, I was thinking even if we lost, we at least would have a record vote, because we were sorely missing that. The only record vote that had taken directly place on abortion was one that I initiated in 1973, because I was a grant reviewer at the Office of Economic Opportunity. That's the anti-poverty agency that was set up under Lyndon Johnson, headed by a Kennedy in-law, Sergeant Shriver. In 1973, I was working there. There were so many ex-nuns and priests, we used to call it the Office of Ecclesiastical Opportunity. But anyway, that's where I found out about Planned Parenthood. So I said, okay, this has got to stop. And I took the information I had and I gave it to then Congressman Larry Hogan of Prince George's, I guess it was. Told him that Legal Service Corporation had in fact done a bunch of the research.
That's Larry Hogan Sr.
Yeah, Sr., right. Had done a bunch of research assisting the pro-abortion people. So I said tax money should not have been used for that purpose. He agreed. He gave my amendment to Congressman Freundlinghuysen, either from Wisconsin or someplace up in the Midwest. It passed, like 360 to 60. We even got Don Edwards, who was a secular humanist, a Democrat from California, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee dealing with constitutional amendments, to vote for it. I was shocked. Now, at that time, the Catholic bishops were opposed to what happened. And in the intervening years, there were hearings in the House and the Senate, but no constitutional amendments were reported. So that's why my friend John Mackey, who worked for a committee now defunct called the Ad Hoc Committee in Defense of Life, funded by the Buckley family out in New York, he did the FOIA, gave it to me, and he knew I had the connections on the Hill to do this. So when I talked to Representative Bauman, explained this, he said, you know, there's a freshman congressman here who just might be interested in this. He said, I will give it to him. I said, okay, thank you. About 3 weeks later, I read in the paper that an amendment was successfully offered, and it had no exceptions. No money in this fund, appropriation bill shall be made available to pay for abortion. Didn't say life of the mother, didn't say rape, didn't say incest, just no abortions. And it passed. It turns out it was Henry Hyde, and that was the origin of that. Now, why should we look at appropriations bills? Well, there's a statement by Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, that virtue has never been as respectable as money. So, well, if you cut the money off, it says, you know, the public should not be forced to sustain this, to support it, to allow this to come to pass. So it's kind of a substitute moral judgment. So good things should be funded with public money, bad things should not. You can't stop all evil, but you don't have to pay for this. So that is kind of back there. Now, James Madison. Who ever heard of James Madison? I hope you students have. He wrote the Federalist Papers along with two other individuals, John Jay, who became a Supreme Court Justice, I think Chief Justice, and Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury later. They wrote a series of essays to get the Constitution, which was proposed in Philadelphia in 1787, ratified. In one of the essays, Federalist 58, James Madison said the following: "This power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure." That's Federalist 58. So the reason the appropriations bills are so important, there's two. Number one, this is the direct stamp of public approval. Number two, the appropriations bills always have to be passed or the government shuts down. Let me repeat that. You don't pass an appropriations bill, the federal employees don't get paid, it shuts down, including the military. I mean, Congress has the power to cut money for anything they want. They cannot, in fact, appropriate money longer than 2 years out for the military. That's in the Constitution. But they're not obligated to fund any of it, constitutionally. It'd be stupid not to, but there's no obligation that they must fund it at certain levels or what. They always can pull it back. And to give you the kind of the example of that, the Hyde Amendment was being challenged by Planned Parenthood. It went to a court in New York. A federal district judge named John Dooling, supposedly a daily communicant, was the one who ruled that the Hyde Amendment was unconstitutional. Now, if you read the Constitution and understand the English language, there's no power to appropriate a dime of money to the courts. None. Only Congress shall appropriate money, and therefore Congress can place limits on it. This decision worked its way up to the United States Supreme Court, and it was sustained in McRae v. Harris that Congress does not have to fund abortion, period, end of discussion. And the proof that this tactic was so really the one to use occurred to me in a very practical way. Congressman Bob Dornan, one of the members of Congress I work for, and I were in a conference committee. A conference committee means it's a meeting of members of the House and the Senate to work out the differences in a bill to report back identical measures to both bodies. So I was working on this bill for Congressman Dornan, so I was the staff aide with him in the Capitol. One of the Democrat conferees was Charlie Rangel, lovable rogue. And he came up to us and he said, "Hey, you guys, you know we differ on abortion." And Dornan and I are like standing here and Charlie's here, and Rangel is putting his finger on Dornan's chest in a very friendly, animated conversation. And he said, "Bob, you know, I would have put in court stripping bills faster than you would have if the court had said they're going to make us spend money on abortion." Now, coming out of Rangel's mouth, this was astounding because Rangel always opposed the Hyde Amendment. He wanted tax money to be used for abortion. But he knew that if the court interfered with and took the power of the purse or attempted to take the power of the purse illicitly from Congress, there's no role for Congress at that point. They cannot play Santa Claus. They're done, finished, it's all over. So Rangel knew, power-wise, policy-wise, politic-wise, he can't afford to lose the power of the purse, or he's done, he might as well not exist. That's why attacking the money is the most powerful and efficacious way to impose a policy, to sustain it. Now, what does that have to do with marriage? Well, if you look at the various appropriations bills, I think there's 12 of them. One of those bills funds the federal judiciary. You never thought of that. But the courts have to pay rent, they have to fix the buildings, they have to pay for just all kind of expenses in running the physical plant of the federal courts. All the staff and paper, Xerox, internet, you name it, they have to do it. That doesn't grow on trees. It comes from where? It comes from Congress. So the Chief Justice normally, although the Chief may send somebody else over, to the House Appropriations Committee and says, we need so much money to do this. So you don't think of a judge begging Congress for money. That's precisely what happens every year. And they give the money. The current appropriations bill for the House, from the House for the courts indicates that you can't spend more than $10,000 of public money on any reception for a judge. Now, that's pretty specific. So if there's a reception, somebody's installed as a new justice or whatever it is, the limit is $10,000. You go beyond that, you're breaking federal law. You have no legal authority to do that. You could be, somebody can go after you for this. There's a law that allows me or you to become in effect, a private attorney general to pull back money that was improperly spent. So you can't do that. So the courts are subject to restrictions already put on by Congress. Now, the Obergefell decision doesn't stand by itself. It has to be implemented. How? Well, the Justice Department implements this to compel a state to change their code, to change from husband and wife to spouse and spouse, something like that. Or to tell justices of the peace or clerks in certain states who don't want to do this, we're going to cut off federal money to Kentucky or Texas or whatever state is doing this if you don't comply with this. This means that a federal U.S. Marshal, if you say to the Justice Appropriations Bill or the Judiciary Appropriations Bill, no money can be used to implement this decision, that means nobody gets paid to do it. It's also illegal to attempt to use federal money to do that. So to do this, you need to have amendments on several appropriations bills. Now these amendments can start in the House and they can start in the Senate. So some of these bills already passed the House, so they have to be initiated in the Senate. But remember, you're dealing with politicians who do not like to go on record for the most part. They will find procedural ways to avoid dealing with a question. So like in the Senate, they've got this thing of avoiding cloture. If you don't get 60 people to shut down debate, you may not be able to proceed. So they hide behind these parliamentary maneuvers. Our purpose must be to say to a member of Congress, you either vote directly up or down on this particular measure, cutting off funding to implement Obergefell, or you vote in a way on a procedural motion to allow a vote on this, or we're going to hold you accountable for sodomy marriage. Personally accountable. You can't do this, Pontius Pilate, the court made its decision, I'm out of here. No, they're responsible. The first attempt to deal with the response in the Senate on the abortion came in a vote that was offered by Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho, to the Hill-Burton law. That was a bill that paid for funding of hospitals, private, public, whatever. And Church was not a right to life guy, but he did not think that especially religious institutions should have to be dragged into abortion. The other side wanted to do that. The amendment passed like 90-1. So conscience protection is part of our First Amendment guarantees. As a matter of fact, Charles Carroll, the senator from Maryland, in the debates in the first Congress, talked about protection of conscience when the question of what became the First Amendment was being debated in Congress. That was the purpose he held for the First Amendment, protection of conscience. So that passed. First vote in the House, as I say, was the one on my amendment that I gave to Congressman Hogan. Next one, three years later, 1976. the Hyde Amendment. Since 2005, an amendment has been added to all the appropriations bills, initially offered by Congressman Weldon. And his amendment says, none of the funds made available in this act, the HHS Appropriations Act, Health Human Services, may be made available to a federal agency or a program or to a state or local government if such agency, program, or government subjects any institution or individual healthcare entity to discrimination on the basis that the healthcare entity does not provide, pay for, provide coverage of, or refer for abortions. So the law already contains these conscience protections for abortion. So it is not a radically new step to say, don't make me be involved in your same-sex marriage. Or don't make me counsel favorably for two guys who think they're married, and I'm supposed to say, yes, keep doing your behavior. So the public fight, I contend, we can shift, because we may have lost, I'm not 100% that we've lost it because of the way that these polling questions have been asked have been very pushing towards a certain goal. But clearly conscience is still respected for now. But if we don't raise this as a public issue, the American conscience on this will also die. And that means this church will either have gay weddings in it, or you will lose the tax status. And is there a school attached to this church? Yes? Okay. Your school will not be accredited to satisfy the compulsory attendance laws unless you support same-sex marriage or have kids of same-sex parents, whatever it is, the connection. The money power will be used against us. I mean, we are in a fight that is not going to end. The other side clearly is not talking tolerance. They're talking imposition. They use the term tolerance as a vehicle to get where they are. They don't mean to end there. That's the beginning of their attempt to compel us to submit to them. Remember the old phrase, misery loves company? As long as there are people like us or institutions like the Catholic Church or other churches who won't do this, it stands as an external condemnation of the internal conscience of the homosexuals who are judging this, who are pushing this, who are part of this, who are promoting this. So in order to stop a nagging conscience, since they don't want to repent internally, they want to suppress external reminders that what they're doing is morally wrong. So that's why they have to proceed to do this. So there is no comfort zone for any of you who bear the sign of faith. Sorry for the bad news. But I can give you tools to fight to defend your conscience so you will not be put in this corner. And if you don't do this now, we're going to be in much worse position later. Now, I can make this available to you if you send me an email, this talk. So if you're not, don't fall asleep, but I mean, if you're not taking good notes, I can give this to you so you can do it. And I want you to share this with individuals in Maryland and all around the United States, because right now, this tactic still hasn't taken hold. I've talked to one of the chiefs of staff and one of the senators running for president who's interested in doing this, but they need to hear from the public to know that what they can do is safe. Quote, safe politically. I mean, look, everybody is not like Bob Marshall, just go and get in the fight and it doesn't matter about the odds. Now that's not always the best way to proceed. It's nice to have an army behind you, but we've got to stake out some of these people, some of these positions to be able to do this. So if you know somebody in Texas, send this memo to them. Then they contact Senator Cruz and say, we want you to do that. Okay, believe me, whatever state you got, you need to send it to your friends, urge them to read this memo, and urge them to act on it. The collective result of this meeting can be an impetus all around the United States to your friends, and then they can send it out to other people. Now, the likely people who would do this are already those members of Congress who support a constitutional amendment. I'm not against the constitutional amendment on marriage, but do you know how many amendments, how many Supreme Court decisions have been reversed by constitutional amendments?
What?
Well,
4.
yeah.
Since 1789, only 4 Supreme Court decisions have ever been reversed by constitutional amendment. So for the marriage people to just put all the money that they have behind a constitutional amendment, historically, is not very prudent. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying we need a lifeboat right now, not the Queen Mary 20 years from now, which may never arrive into port. Anyway, we need a lifeboat now to keep us afloat from being swamped by this wave here. So House members who've been disaffected by Speaker Boehner would have an interest in doing this. Republican senators running for president would have an interest in doing this. And members of the Congress, 140 plus, who supported Representative Black's bill to prevent abortion-related discrimination would also support this. Now, how do you actually get a vote? When the Appropriations Committee in the House reports a bill out, they send it to the House Rules Committee. The Rules Committee gets together and they hear testimony. And they then provide standards, guidelines, or a rule for the offering and rejecting of amendments. If you're not covered in there, you can't offer one of these amendments. So what you have to do is, you've got Andy Harris, right?
Yes.
Okay, you need to get him involved in this very deeply. If a rule does not provide for or specifically excludes the offering of an amendment that would protect our conscience rights against Obergefell, you've got to tell Andy Harris, we want you to vote no on the rule governing terms of debate for the appropriations bill. And you need to tell the Republican leadership why you're voting no. So that's the first thing that you have to do. The second thing is, if a rule is being offered, if I'm on the floor of the House of Representatives, I offer an amendment to the rule. And if that's struck out of order, I'm going to appeal that striking out of order. So then the vote on the motion to strike out of order becomes the de facto vote on protecting marriage. You cannot let these weasels out of anything. You have got to nail them down either on a direct, substantive vote or a procedural vote that would affect whether you could offer this. So those are the things that you do in the House. You can, again, the House has only limitation powers. You can't order a federal agent to do something, but you can prohibit them from doing something. So this is negative in purpose, in function. The Senate doesn't have a rules committee, so it's up to the Republican leadership to do this. And the reason you want to get a bill with multiple aspects to it is you want to make it hard for Obama to veto it. What do I mean? If Obama vetoes a bill that funds about 6 agencies of government, let's pretend it's the entire continuing resolution. A continuing resolution is where all 12 appropriations bills are put together as one funding bill for the entire government. We need to be able to get our people to offer amendments to say no money to discriminate against chaplains who won't preside at same-sex weddings. No money to strip tax-exempt status from churches that won't be involved in this. No money to require schools receiving grant money to do any of this stuff. You've got to offer this a number of ways. We need record votes so you can see who's with us and who's against us. Remember, the New Testament says evil loves the darkness. It says in the book of Hosea, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. We need to have ways to understand what those who are accountable to us, who are elected to us, who are supposed to secure the common good are doing. And the only way to do that is to get an up or down vote on these particular questions. So, we need to get votes, in other words, like on the bill funding the Small Business Administration, that would prohibit them from being required to offer same-sex marriage benefits. We need to have an amendment prohibiting the implementation of any executive order requiring same-sex marriage in any aspect of federal government. Right now, the House Appropriations Financial Services and General Government Report put amendments in that's following. Prohibiting the White House from ordering the IRS to determine the tax-exempt status of an organization. They're already going down this road. We just need to make them turn down a little side road to include us as well. This says this checks the expansion of the executive branch agencies by prohibiting funding for signing statements that abrogate existing law. In other words, when Obama says, I'm signing this law, but it doesn't mean the following. This amendment, this provision, which is already in the Financial Services Bill, which funds the Executive Office of the President, says these signing statements are not worth the paper they're written on. You can't enforce them. So the House of Representatives under Boehner has already done these specific things right now. And if you get a letter back from any member of Congress saying, we can't do this, say, oh, yes, you can. You already are doing this. So, again, we need amendments to prohibit the Civil Rights Commission from requiring this, from ordering Catholic schools to be involved with this, with hiring homosexual married teachers. Right now, the Mount St. DeSales Academy in Macon, Georgia, is a Catholic school. It's a liberal Catholic school, and they're reaping what they've sown here. They had hired a guy knowing that he was homosexual. And this guy went out and, quote, got married to a man. They then fired him at that point. He was a band teacher. He said, you can't do that. My rights, my equal opportunity rights are being destroyed by your doing this. He filed a complaint with the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is one of the agencies we could prevent from getting funds to do this. The EEOC issued a show cause order to St. Francis de Sales to say, you need to hire this guy back. Okay, and if you don't, you're going to be subject to fines. This is where Obama is going. He's not letting us off the hook. We have no place to run, no place to hide. We only can turn and fight prudentially and forcefully and prayerfully, I might add. So, this is what's coming. Let me give you some specific areas. We need Hyde Amendment protections that should do the following. Prohibit the tax-exempt status of any church, institution, or university, school, or nonprofit entity declining to facilitate or participate in same-sex marriage. We need to have one of those offered. Requiring any federal contractor or grantee to accommodate same-sex marriage. We can't allow money to be used to discipline military chaplains who decline to perform or to participate in same-sex marriage. We cannot use any money to require federal employees to undergo sexual attitude restructuring education to accommodate same-sex marriage. We withhold any federal grant or contract money to any state which declines to implement same-sex marriage. In other words, Obama wants to cut off money, to states that won't do this. And we do not allow money to be used to prohibit the free speech of those who advocate for one-man, one-woman agencies. We don't want money to be allowed to use to coerce state or local governments or private organizations to comply with Obergefell. And this is the real kick in the head for the liberals in the long run. We put an amendment to the Judiciary Appropriations Act that prohibits them from hearing any case decided after Obergefell on a law upholding marriage only between one man and one woman. Now, can we do this? Absolutely. I have a memo from John Roberts. Who's John Roberts?
Chief Justice.
Chief Justice. In the early 1980s, he was an assistant attorney general at the Justice Department. He wrote a very long 26-page memo. Don't get scared, I've reduced it to 2 pages. Where he says Congress can cut off the jurisdiction of federal courts on anything they want to dealing with appellate jurisdiction under the Article 3 powers. Just totally eviscerate them. Now here's the Chief Justice when he's an assistant AG saying this. I can send you this memo. So, we have the law on our side, but we must have people like yourself contacting members to give them the impetus to stand up and to do the right thing. So we have the ability, legal ability to do it. You have the knowledge to do that. You need to do it. Let me give you where this has been successful in the past. Money was cut off for military funding in late 1974, early 75, which halted American support of the Vietnam War, which led to the fall of Saigon in 1975. Again, this is an appropriations amendment. You know about the Hyde Amendment in 1976. An amendment was put on an appropriations bill, foreign aid bill, to prohibit the assistance of any anti-communist in Angola from overthrowing the communist government there. That was 1975, 1976. The amendment, which I helped devise for Bob Dornan, prohibited federal monies from paying for abortion in the District of Columbia in the military in the late 1970s. And when I was the legislative assistant for Bob Dornan, the lobbyists for the National Association of Evangelical Schools came to us and told us that the Carter administration was requiring 501c3 schools to prove their innocence from racial discrimination rather than the IRS to prove you're discriminating and then you lose your tax status. So we said, wait a minute, you're reversing the order of American justice here. You don't have to prove your innocence, the government has to prove your guilt. So I devised an amendment for Bob Dornan to put on the Treasury Appropriations Bill, and we took the IRS ruling, there was a specific number, and we said no money in this bill may be used to implement IRS ruling, whatever, 1, 2, 3. I took this information to Senator Eagleton's staff. Remember, he was the guy who ran for vice president, and then, you know, McGovern dumped him. Eagleton supported this amendment in the Senate because the initial set of schools that were being hit by this ruling was the Missouri Synod schools. So that, as far as I know, that is still law. And in 1982, Congress prohibited the use of tax money to assist the Contra rebels from overthrowing the Nicaraguan government. So this has been used by liberals, Democrats, moderates, everybody. This is nothing new. This policy tool is there. We who have the sign of faith on us and the knowledge of this must use this, or we then become kind of responsible like the guy who hid his talents and didn't want to use them. What happened when his master came back? Threw him out. Why? Well, I was afraid. Sorry, you can't be driven by fear. You have to be driven by knowledge here. So these high-type amendments can be lifeboats for us, for our faith, for our families, and for our churches. I was astounded on July 5th in my own parish, All Saints in Manassas. The pastor read his statement about Obergefell, calling it an unjust decision and get ready for persecution. At the end of his homily, what happened? Applause. I mean, you normally don't get applause. You're going to be persecuted. Yay, right on. I mean, but why did the people applaud? Because this pastor was standing up for the truth of the faith without being intimidated. Now, we need to have this happen in churches around the United States.
Amen.
Period. They must do this. They don't do it, they're going to get rolled. There is no, safe hiding place. Now, why do we need to do this? We need to do it, and you need to do it on appropriations bills, because we need to spread the pain if Obama decides to veto this. I will never forget this. When we were having a fight, I think it was 79, we got calls, and I was with Bob Dornan on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was working this amendment. We got calls from contractors saying, why are you blocking this? And we said, we're not blocking this at all. They said, well, we need to get paid. So we sent the message back, you tell Tip O'Neill to stop demanding that he wants to pay for abortion. These contractors who had just proceeded from their current paychecks, they started jumping on O'Neill. So we said, we're ready to fund this bill, but O'Neill wants to pay for abortion. So they said, what the hell does abortion have to do with this bill? Just fund what's there so we can get the money. So that is what we need to do. If Obama is all of a sudden going to punish everybody in the United States because he wants his sodomy marriage friends to be able to oppress us, he's going to take the pain. And the Republicans don't have to, they really shouldn't worry about this. But we need to do this to spread the pain, to make it hard for him to do this, to show how radical Obama really is. Remember, he pretended he thought marriage was only between a man and a woman up through 2012. Okay?
Liar.
Of course he probably was. But, that his, quote, enlightenment hasn't descended upon us, we shouldn't be taken there. But again, if you look at the polls The support for same-sex marriage has dropped since the decision. Why? Because some of where the advocates for same-sex marriage want to go is now starting to become apparent to more of the public who's been sleeping through this whole thing. So I will stop right there, and I will take your questions. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what we hear from our priests is that they don't want to talk about this political stuff because they're afraid to lose their tax status. But it's obvious to me if they don't start doing something, they're going to lose their tax status anyway. So we should remind them that this fear is no longer there. It's, you know, it's going to evaporate, right?
My wife and I were the pro-life coordinators for the Arlington Catholic Diocese for several years, from 1976 to when I started working for Bob Dornan in 1979. And I was sent by my bishop to the meeting of the pro-life coordinators for the whole United States, and Cardinal Cook was presiding at the pro-life committee. And I kind of asked the same question. I said, you know, I have it on fairly good authority, not, you know, infallible, that one of the questions that Catholic bishops will not be asked when they face our Lord at the end of their life is, how well did you protect the tax status? Well, I mean, it made Cardinal Cook a bit uncomfortable, but that's just what I do. But the question of tax status came up in the oral arguments on Obergefell. There was a reference to a court case called Bob Jones, or IRS versus Bob Jones, out of South Carolina, in which a school down there forbade interracial dating or something like this, and they lost their tax status. So that's coming. I mean, the Solicitor General, who's the guy who argues, or the lady who argues for the Obama administration, acknowledged as much, and we're going to have to deal with that. So, if you put saving your tax status above saving marriage, I mean, you're not too bright anyway. And you will not save it if you are timid to protect it. You're only going to save it if you say, excuse me, I have a right to talk about this from the pulpit. This is not partisan politics. This is public policy.
This is saving souls.
It's saving souls. It's saving families. That should not come up. But if it does come up, say, Father, when you were ordained a priest, were you there to preach Christ crucified, or only Christ crucified if you don't jeopardize the tax status? And you know what? The devil with the tax status. Then you would really be free. I mean, I'm not saying you have to protect this, but know that it's coming and know that you've got to fight. This lady and then the gentleman over here.
Do you want to give us your email?
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, yeah. Delegate Bob, DELEGATE, BOB @gmail.com. And I will send you, there's 2 memos. I've got this one here. It's about 6 pages long and a 1-page addendum.
Excuse me, what should we put in like the memo line? So
Just say send the marriage memos to,
Marriage memos,
Do
okay.
you want us to be part of your email list, sir?
There's a way to do that. If you go to my website, delegatebob.com, you can sign up to receive alerts.
But do we have to be in your district?
No. I mean, I can send this to Premier Putin if I wanted to. If he wants to sign up, I'll send it to him.
Another question.
The gentleman over. Did you have a question?
Well, Dennis Wild, I'm Associate Director at Priesthood Life for the Francophone, who is coming out with a book in August, and it's begun of ending abortion. He has one preceding that, but this one gets into, and he's done a lot of study on the whole tax exemption bugaboo, which is all it is. The IRS doesn't know where they stand, and they don't want to take it to the court because they fear that they'll lose. The problem is, and I agree with what the lady said over here, and with the same passion that you have, and I agree that tax exemption is not exactly what St. Peter went into the synagogue in the Acts of the Apostles and didn't tell the person, he said, well, we've got to be careful about our tax exemption, we're not going to preach about Jesus Christ. But the point is that the whole thing that came in 54, which is an addendum to Lyndon Johnson's getting back at some cronies in Texas, this whole thing hasn't been really tried. It's been tried once, and the church got penalized for it with a tremendous penalty. One day, it lost its tax exemption. 1 day. That's the whole history of the penalty of the IRS. I wish our bishops would understand that, for goodness sake, and get over this stupid nonsense and bugaboo. It sounds here sickening. But read that book that he's coming out with, and it's in August. It's going to be.
And what would the name of the book be, Father?
It's Abolishing Abortion, I think is the name of it. Ending Abortion, Abolishing Abortion. But look under it. I've read it already. We're using it and I'm going to have it in our monthly meeting. But there's a whole 3 or 4 chapters that go into quotes, histories, and the problems that are given in dioceses that brown nose up to the whole government on the IRS on this thing. They're making it much worse than the law even allows us to do.
Yes.
It's a lot much more that the law even allows us to do. And by the way, it's not a law. It's really a commentary on a law. And the head legal man in Washington, sends us out to the diocese. The diocese sends it out to the different parishes. And the further out you go, the more compelling the thing sounds. And it's just a lot of it's just conjecture.
Yeah.
Last
I
question.
say that for
We used to get, when my wife and I worked for the Arlington Diocese, we always used to get collared by the General Counsel for the United States Catholic Conference. You can't be afraid of this, but the utility, the public relations utility of this approach is you need to get votes on all these different aspects of it to show the public how extreme the homosexual lobby really is. In a certain sense, I don't even care if I lose the vote. Just give me a record vote, because then I can go after you. And that's what the other side doesn't want to do. And Boehner and McConnell are deathly afraid of going on record on this in an effective way. The lady here.
Like you, I'm a former legislative assistant. I work for Silk County on the Appropriations Committee.
Okay.
And the Rules Committee, Butler Derrick, who was very long
Yes.
time vice chairman. I know the dilatory tactics are very removed for people who didn't work up there. Why couldn't, if the laws passes with the appropriations bills and whatnot, and those amendments are put intact, why couldn't the president do a line item veto and then send the bill? You can't do that on appropriations?
Yes, he has no authority to do a line item veto. The Supreme Court struck down an attempt to give him the line item veto back in the 1990s.
How about a pocket veto?
Let him do it.
Then nothing gets
He
funded.
has.
Oh, then
You
it
see
should
what I
be
mean?
shut down. Okay,
Then the
I
government shuts
understand.
down.
I understand.
Let
Okay.
him pay for
Well, it's
this.
very interesting. I think it might be a good strategy. A lot of members of Congress would be more effective than people on the street that don't know these. Maybe I'm wrong.
Let me give you an example. I forget the gentleman's name, but I think it was about 147 BC when a legate from Rome went to Carthage, and he was talking to one of the Carthaginian government leaders. And the Roman general or delegate said, "We need you to, make a decision about whether or not you're going to agree with Rome or not." And the guy said, "I'll give you my decision later." The Roman went up in the sand with a stick, drew a circle around him. He says, "Make your decision before you step outside the circle." Okay? We need to be as tough, as tight, and as firm as that decision right there.
And get recorded votes.
Get recorded votes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delegate.